Hello, everybody. It's Connor from Factory Productions here. Welcome into another episode of the Create Smarter podcast. I'm joined by my two best buddies, Marisa Jake and Jake Steiner. And we're here to talk about some current events. You know, in the office, we like to put some stuff on in the background to keep us going. And we've been watching a lot of the Winter Olympics 2026, broadcast from Italy. Beautiful scenes out there in the snow. And we want to talk about kind of the Olympics and how we, as video producers, look at broadcast a little differently than maybe everyone else does, and how we can kind of wrap that back into what FiveTool does throughout the year, making content for our clients. Marisa, talk to me a little bit about that. Watching the Super Bowl just happened, Olympics are on right now. How do you view that a little differently, and what have you noticed in the broadcast for the Olympics so far?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think that the producer, like NBC producers, Olympics producers, have already kind of figured out, like, okay, we need to show people how to, view this a little bit differently. And that's when they introduce Gold Zone. And that's what we've had on, is that, let's show everybody everything and let them watch a little bit of everything. But I think that we start to pick out notes of, oh, what's in this broadcast? And, oh, how are they shooting that? And then we spend so much time analyzing, wait, how did they get that shot? So I think there's a couple layers to the answer to this question. I think the broadcast is one of them, and that, how do you fill a whole day's worth of content, even when there's all these races going on? There's going to be lulls and things like that. So how do you fill those? And then there's other things like the camera angles. They're high action sports. So how do you capture, when luge athletes go around the corner, how do you get that? So I think there's a couple different things that are interesting to note. I
agree. And, you make a good point about that all day long kind of coverage. I don't really remember much about before Gold Zone, that kind of idea, what did we watch? Just what they want to show us, But it relates to some stuff that we've done over the past of live streams, longer live streams, all day live streams, and kind of filling that day with content that'll keep people coming back, keep people tuning in. So Jake, anything to add of, what have you noticed throughout the day? How do they keep your attention while we're watching the broadcast?
Yeah, I mean, I think they do a fantastic job of mixing kind of that personal aspect of the individual athletes as well as the actual sport itself. And like we were saying, trying to figure out how you tie that all in and keep a smooth flowing broadcast over a course of, I think it's a 14-hour, 16-hour span. It's incredibly impressive. And there's so much post and pre-production. And again, that's how we're looking at it. We're viewing it that's, filmed 6 months ago, that's, whatever it may be. But, it's incredibly impressive how much production value actually goes into the Olympics and the grand scale of everything. And it's cool to kind of think about that and then also bring that into our own productions whenever we have the ability to do some of these fun, creative, and especially these longer broadcasts.
Yeah.
Which you've done. But I was even thinking about this morning as I was getting ready, I had the Olympics on, and I was like, okay, what are they showing when they're not showing an event? Because there's kind of a lull between, I don't remember what events were on this morning, but then they brought in the hosts of Gold Zone, and they have this whole coffee break angle where it's all right, it's the morning for everybody, wake it up, grab your coffee, sit down, and we're going to chat about things. It's all right, there's no event going on, so how do we fill that time? And I saw an interview with, I can't remember exactly who it was, but it was somebody that was involved in getting the curling rink ready to go. And so they were interviewing him about what kind of different aspects, maybe the audience questions were being answered by this random interview where we're not talking about an athlete specifically, but we're kind of answering and filling those holes that audiences have when they're watching events. And then they were bringing up social posts of people tweeting at the Gold Zone and things like that. So it's just how do you add in these little things and make the experience honestly even more overwhelming for audiences, because there's already so much content to view, but sometimes there are the lulls in the content. So what other things can you add in to make it interesting and keep people engaged all day, all 16 hours of Gold Zone?
Yes, which is important if you want engagement. Talking more about our stuff, obviously NBC and the bigger players in the field are going to get engagement no matter what. But how do you get people tuning in? How do you get people to share, talk about it, like you're saying, about the social boards or Twitter or anything like that? And how do you get people to come back and keep watching? Moving on, or I guess maybe a little more specifically, just I want to mention some of the cooler stuff that we've seen. We talk about noticing or thinking about how do they get that shot? How do they accomplish this, goal, going into a luge or a ski jump or something? Jake, do you want to walk us through a little bit about what's the different kind of technology that you've seen, used in the Olympics so far?
Yeah, it's as from a technical aspect, I nerd out over all of it.
You're the one that nerds out about it, I think.
I think
half the fun.
I think it is so so impressive how many different cameras that they have, for one event, let alone, like you said, the gold zone, you've got 4 different events, so that, X amount of cameras times 4, probably times 10. There's probably, 10 events happening at the same time. It makes me so incredibly happy.
Feel bad for that producer. Whoever's doing that switch behind the scenes.
Unbelievable. It's unbelievable. But some of the cooler, pieces of, tech that we're seeing is, we've watched a lot of the luge in the bobsledding. And even that, like you watch, they have these, little drones that they have going in and out of the actual racetrack itself, following the athletes. Maybe that's something you definitely wouldn't have seen, 3 events ago. Like this is the newer technology that they're integrating in, and they're constantly adapting and trying to find new ways. I think we were talking earlier about speed skating. They have the tracking camera that follows around, the athletes. They're going 35 miles an hour on the ice. Like you have to have, there's not going to be some guy running with a camera next to him. So to have the technology where it's a literal, camera on a track that stabilizes and goes 35, it blows me away. I could go on and on about some of the equipment and some of the tech. It's just such a massive production, and it's really, really cool, and they get very creative.
I think it's funny, too. This just popped into my head thinking of things I've seen on social about the Olympics. You think of the cameras that are necessary to show the broadcast, but then there's also like the social content side of things. Right. And I saw there was this guy that was on the ice with a big gimbal, and he's skating with a gimbal to get like behind the scenes shots of like the ice skaters and the figure skaters. And it's like that is such a niche job where like you have to combine, your skating interest and your video interest to be good at both.
Yeah.
But it's also like talking about kind of the cool nerdy ways that like, we can observe how they're getting some of this content. They're skating with a gimbal, and I'm like, I couldn't do that. That's crazy.
Down at the skates. Yeah. Maybe Five Tool should put some time into that.
I think it's interesting too, though. Back to the point that you made. I think that some of that we've talked about camera angles in the past, like taking away from the event itself. And we've talked about in the past, when the Celtics or any basketball game has tried to incorporate some cool shots, it's almost like taking away, and it makes me as a viewer kind of angry where I'm like, it feels like it's affecting the game. I can't actually see
an assault on the senses.
It's an assault on the senses.
On the senses.
Talking too much with my hands. Sorry. That's an assault on the senses. But for some of these events like luge or even skiing, like you can't have somebody skiing down the slope with a camera. Like you need to find cool ways to get different shots, incorporate different tech. It's not additive. It's almost necessary.
Yes.
Where, when you think about the things that are happening in football or basketball, like kind of the more basic sports, producers, I think, are looking for different ways to spice up a broadcast, which is all fine and good, and sometimes there's pros and cons to that. But I think for the Olympics and those specific sports, there are certain things where it's like, no, we need to figure out how to capture this because otherwise we're going to have somebody on skates or on skis with a camera, and that's not going to work.
Yeah, and I like that you mentioned that because it's kind of gets me thinking about what we're able to accomplish and things like drones, a snowboarder going off a jump or a luge coming down a corner at incredible speeds. I'm thinking of things that humans, us three couldn't accomplish, so it's up to the producer or the content producer to think outside the box and say, okay, we have the capability, we have the technology. How do we accomplish those feats that humans couldn't get, or just shots that we couldn't get in easy ways? So Jake, you and I actually worked on a project recently with a client of ours doing some research profiles where we wanted to kind of think outside the box. Maybe the topic wasn't as exciting as other things, such as luge and bobsledding, but we still wanted to use some creative shots and just make a different type of video to catch that audience's, attention and keep them entertained throughout. Bring us through a little bit about our thought process and what we were able to accomplish on that shoot.
Yeah, we had pretty incredible story kind of come across our desk for a project. And, when we get stuff like this, like it's really fun that we get to kind of stretch our creative muscles. And, this was specifically a doctor who specialized in, neurology studies, way beyond whatever I can understand. But also has this passion and this hobby for, downhill extreme mountain biking. How crazy, polar opposite, the juxtaposition between the two. So we had the ability to actually both go to this person's lab, but also to go to their trails that they regularly mountain bike. So we had some fun, and we had to get really creative and think about how can we capture this and make this into kind of like a cohesive piece, without a guy running next to them.
Exactly. And to mention, none of us are extreme bikers either.
No.
Oh, you didn't speak for yourself.
And so we had to get really creative. We had to think, outside the box. We had to try new things, which is always fun. It's always something that we look forward to. And specifically, we have a 360 camera. This is a camera that, as its title implies, it captures video in 360 format. And it can be mounted in kind of, places where, you never really would be able to put, a big cinema camera or any camera for that matter. And so we were actually able to attach that camera to the handlebars of the bike, as well as we actually have like a chest mount that we were able to attach to get this kind of like crazy video game, behind the back angle that kind of gave this like third person perspective. No human would ever be able to get that, as well as this kind of crazy little like side angle of him going through the mount or the trails and whatnot. And those are such creative and such unique shots that if anyone goes by and they see it, it has to capture your attention.
Right.
It locks a viewer in. They see something like that, they're like, well, how do they do that? How do you get that perspective? Those types of things catch viewers' eyes, and it holds the viewer to the content. So getting really creative, getting really, out of the box, thinking outside of the box is what I'm trying to say. And implementing techniques that, make sense to the content that you're recording.
Right. To Marissa's point about not going extreme, but, in the planning, working with the client, we wanted that juxtaposition. I'm glad you brought that up of like, yes, he's a doctor in his work life, but in personal life, he does this really cool, interesting activity. How do we, film regular B-roll in the lab, but then juxtapose that with awesome, creative, out-of-the-box B-roll, footage shots in a cool environment like the trails. It was great.
Yeah.
But what other kind of techniques did we use, or what in the final product, what did you see us use while we're talking about these interesting creative techniques?
Really, when we looking at the two settings, like you're looking at a research lab versus the wilderness, like we have to figure out in advance how do we transition from that environment to the other seamlessly and make it not so jarring for the viewer. So in advance we plan specific camera movements from one setting to another, whether that was walking through a lab going left to right. We then outside have a movement left to right with the camera that we're able to kind of transition, a tree's in the shot. We'll use that tree to transition to the wilderness. Doorways in the shot. We'll, use that doorway to transition back into that research lab. This is all planning that we have to go ahead, but to, really get that juxtaposition of the research lab to the outside, we had to plan ahead. We had to plan our camera techniques in advance. And it all comes back to that, creative thinking and using our creative muscles when it comes to, production. Exactly.
And to tie this all back, a lot of planning probably goes in the Olympics, if I had to guess. And we've seen that throughout. And they don't need to do anything kind of crazy because they have our attention already. We tuned in, which is good enough. Things that we have to think about in the content marketing space is how do you stop the scroll? How do you keep their attention during the video? If it's over 2 minutes, are they going to tune out, click off, that kind of stuff. So to Jake's point, little techniques that, well, I call them little, but they're pretty big. A lot of planning goes into it. A lot of techniques has to get it right. But little parts of the videos will go a long way, I think, in the final product. So to wrap us up here, talking more about what we do, how we work with clients, how we talk to clients, and kind of try to get their minds in the spaces that we view broadcast and that sorts. Each of you, if you want to give me a pro and con of kind of why should a client consider thinking outside the box, and what should they be wary of?
Yeah, I think there's almost two different conversations here because I'm going to go at it at the broadcast angle, and I have a feeling you're going to go at it at the video production angle, which is good because that's just two arms of my business. I'm thinking of, a broadcast that we do for one of our clients that's coming up, and we're in the planning stages, and it's, how do you get people to watch? And so I think that's kind of, to your point, yes, people are going to watch the Olympics, but how do you get them to stay all day? And that's kind of when you talk about like the, kind of trying to anticipate audience questions and think about content that they'll tune in for. Things that it's almost like a behind the scenes look, an insider's perspective, like those interviews with the people that paint the lines on the ski jumps or the people that set up the ice for curling, things like that. So I think that thinking about maybe the little things that normally your audience doesn't get to see. You know, we're going to do a university broadcast, so we're going to do a lot of content creator material from students. So it's how do the students show what they're doing on campus through their eyes that people don't normally see. And so it's just about like kind of giving that little behind the scenes of what can we add to your experience that'll kind of keep your attention. A con, though, I don't know, and I'm going to pass it on to Jake.
There are no cons.
No cons of thinking outside of the box. I think, actually, maybe I'll take that back. To our point about before, sometimes, additive versus necessary. I think that if you go too far one way, it can be distracting. I was thinking as Jake was talking about this video shoot that you guys did with one of our clients, it's kind of a little bit of both. It's additive, but also necessary. Like, you probably could have done that video without all the fun gadgets and gizmos, but it's not interesting that way.
Yes, right.
And also, how do you get biking video without mounting a camera to a bike? Like it's not super easy. So it's kind of a little bit of both. But I think the con then would be if you go too far into the assault on the senses, then you're distracting from the content. And I think there's a time and a place for both kind of things.
Can't go full X Games mode when you're trying to sell
No.
Also try to tell a story about a doctor.
We were talking about another project that I'm working on for kind of like an athletics hype video and doing a bunch of fun graphics treatments there.
Right.
If we tried that in a Spalding research story, I don't think that would necessarily. Yeah, exactly. That's too additive.
Think of the content. Think of the audience. Think of where they're going to see it and how they're going to take it in.
Right. So you could definitely go way too far one way, and you kind of have to know what kind of content you're creating.
Great point. Yeah. Jake, how about you, sir?
No, I think there's a lot of crossover between broadcast and production. I mean, it comes down to retention, getting clicks, stopping the viewer. We're making content that, maybe gets posted on social media, like, and people are scrolling. You need to get that finger to stop moving, right? You got to get it to stop, get the eyes, get the brain going on that video specifically. So, to talk about, using different techniques in order to, allow retention to happen. The pros are you're able to get something unique. You're able to get something that's different, something that, hopefully, the viewer might not have seen before. The cons, that's a slippery slope. If it's, we're doing a story on someone who's, a chess player as a hobby, like, to strap, a GoPro to them and then try to have them go around.
Hold on, I'm writing this down. That's a great idea.
But to the point before of like, that's not necessary to capture the content. Think about the audience. Think about the goal.
Absolutely. And it becomes silly. You've taken away some of the gusto of that video by making it kind of outlandish. Like there's no need for it. So there's a balance to it. There's places where it's needed to get really creative. Try different unique angles and unique shots. Anything with movement, generally, you can figure it out. But make it reasonable to the content that is actually being produced. Don't do something just to do it, just to say, hey, we did this. It was really cool. We put a GoPro on someone and had them, sit down at a chess table. Like, there's a balance to it, and trying to figure out where things make sense is really important. And that's where our pre-production comes in, and we decide, we make these decisions about what equipment to bring, what equipment techniques we should be using. And it all goes into the final mission of the video. Like the goal of the video is, okay, if this is to, stop someone and attract new viewers, like maybe we do something a little crazy, something new, but, it's got to make sense to the mission of the video, and it's got to make sense to the overall, what the content being shot is actually about and what you're actually watching. It's got to make sense, ultimately.
Hey, you heard it here first. Got to make sense. I like that. Anything else you guys want to add? Anything we might have missed?
No, I think we talk each other's ears off, and I think that
it's always it's a bad thing. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys. Thanks so much.
USA.
Go USA. Yeah. Get some USA in the comments. Go Team USA. Shout out to the Quad God. And hey, I'm Connor, Marisa, Jake from 5-2 Productions. Thanks again for listening to the Create Smarter podcast, and we will catch you next time.